Amara Bello sat on the cold cement floor of her small rented room, her back pressed against a peeling wall that had seen too many tenants come and go without leaving anything behind except silence, and as the dim yellow bulb flickered above her head, she held her stomach with both hands as if trying to steady not just the life growing inside her but the storm rising within her chest, because just moments ago the man she loved, the man whose laughter once filled this room like sunlight, had walked out with a suitcase and a careful expression that hurt more than anger ever could, and he had not looked back, not once, not even for a second, and in that moment Amara understood something that no book had ever taught her, that abandonment does not always arrive loudly, sometimes it comes quietly, politely, with folded shirts and measured footsteps, leaving behind a silence so heavy it reshapes the air itself, and she closed her eyes and whispered to the child inside her, her voice trembling, but steady in intention, "It's just you and me now, and I promise you, we will be enough," not knowing that this fragile promise would become the foundation of a life far stronger than anything she had planned before, because Amara had always been a planner, the kind of woman who wrote her future in neat lines inside a small notebook she kept hidden beneath her pillow, a future filled with degrees, stability, independence, and a quiet kind of happiness that did not rely on anyone else's choices. But life had introduced her to Tund Savage, a man who carried ease like a second skin, who smiled like the world had always been kind to him, and who made her believe, slowly, gently, that maybe she could set down her careful defenses and feel something reckless and warm, and for a while, she did. She let herself soften, she let herself trust, she let herself imagine a future that included someone else standing beside her instead of just her shadow, but now that illusion had collapsed into the space he left behind, and what remained was not heartbreak in the dramatic sense but something quieter, sharper, a realization that she would have to rebuild everything from the ground up while carrying another life within her, and yet even in that moment, even with only a few thousand naira left in her account and no clear path ahead, Amara did not collapse, because she had been raised in a home where survival was not a choice but a discipline, where her father measured success in effort and her mother turned scarcity into sustenance with sheer willpower, and so after exactly 1 hour of sitting in that silence, she stood up, washed her face, boiled water for tea, and opened her notebook, and with a steady hand she began to write again, not the old plan, the one that had included comfort and predictability, but a new one, harder, sharper, built for a woman who no longer had the luxury of waiting for life to be kind, and in that moment something shifted inside her, something permanent. Because she was no longer just a young woman with dreams, she was now a mother with a mission, and every decision from that point forward would carry the weight of that responsibility, and though she did not know how difficult the coming years would be, she understood one thing with absolute clarity: no one was coming to save her, and that was not a tragedy, it was a truth, and truths, when accepted fully, become power, and as the night deepened around her and the city outside continued its restless rhythm, Amara Bello wrote the first line of the life she would build from nothing, a life that would one day stand so strong that even the man who walked away would not recognize the woman she had become, because this was the beginning, not of loss, but of transformation. The journey back to her parents' house in Abeokuta felt longer than the miles it took to get there, not because of distance, but because every passing kilometer carried the weight of a life she was leaving behind and a future she could not yet fully see. And as the bus rattled along uneven roads under a sky that threatened rain, Amara Bello sat by the window with her small bag clutched tightly to her side, her other hand resting unconsciously over her stomach as though already forming a bond stronger than fear, and she watched the familiar landscapes of Ogun State come into view, the roadside stalls, the rusted roofs, the women balancing baskets on their heads with quiet dignity, and she wondered not for the first time how she would explain everything without breaking under the truth of it. Because disappointment, especially in the eyes of those who raised you to be careful, cuts deeper than failure itself, yet when she finally stepped into the modest family home where she had grown up, she found not judgment waiting for her but something far more powerful and unexpected, a silence that listened before it spoke. Her father seated at the old wooden table where he had graded papers for years, his glasses low on his nose, his expression unreadable, while her mother stood near the doorway gripping the edge of her wrapper as if holding herself together, and Amara told them everything, every detail stripped of excuses, every choice owned fully, her voice steady even when her heart was not. And when she finished, the room held that same dense silence she had felt the night she told Tund, but this time it was not filled with retreat, it was filled with consideration, with the slow, deliberate processing of people who understood that life is not as clean as the plans we make for it. And after what felt like an eternity, her father spoke just one sentence, calm and firm: "You will stay here, you will have this child, and then you will finish what you started," and in that moment something inside her loosened, not because the road ahead had become easier, but because she was no longer walking it alone, and her mother, without a word, disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a plate of hot food, placing it in front of her before sitting down beside her and taking her hand in a grip that said everything language could not, that love does not withdraw when mistakes are made, it adjusts, it strengthens, it holds tighter, and that night Amara lay in her childhood bed, staring at the ceiling she had once imagined leaving forever, realizing that sometimes moving forward requires stepping back into the very place you thought you had outgrown, but this return was not defeat, it was preparation. And in the months that followed she carried her pregnancy with a quiet determination that surprised even her, helping her mother when she could, reading when she had the strength, rewriting her plans in her mind again and again until they began to take shape. In a new form, one that accounted for sleepless nights and responsibilities she had never anticipated, and when the day finally came, on a Thursday morning wrapped in rain that tapped softly against the hospital windows, her daughter was born with a cry so fierce it filled the entire room, as if announcing not just her arrival but her refusal to be anything less than significant, and Amara held her close, feeling the small, warm weight against her chest, and in that instant the fear that had shadowed her for months shifted into something else entirely, something sharper and more focused, purpose, and she named her Tiwa, a name that carried meaning beyond sound, a declaration that this child was not a burden or a mistake but a gift she would protect with everything she had. And as she looked into her daughter's tiny, determined face, she made a second promise, stronger than the first, that no matter how hard the road ahead became, she would not allow this child to feel the absence that had once threatened to define her own story. And so 6 weeks after giving birth, while her body still carried the memory of pain and her nights were broken into fragments of sleep, Amara began again. Not in the polished offices she had once imagined but in a small private school where she taught mathematics and economics to restless teenagers who did not know they were being taught by a woman quietly rebuilding her life piece by piece, and every day she stood in front of that classroom, she sharpened not only their minds but her own resolve, saving every naira she could, studying scholarship opportunities late into the night while Tiwa slept beside her, and though exhaustion became a constant companion, she wore it like armor, because she understood now that survival was not enough. She was not just trying to get by, she was building something that would one day stand as proof that beginnings do not determine endings, and as the months turned into years and rejection letters came and went like passing storms, she did not stop. Because the promise she made on that cold floor in Ibadan and the one she made in that rainy hospital room were no longer just words, they were the blueprint of a future she was determined to bring to life, no matter how long it took or how hard it became. The years that followed did not arrive gently or in neat, inspiring sequences the way success stories are often told. They came in waves, uneven, exhausting, and relentless. And Amara Bello learned very quickly that survival was not a single act of strength but a daily discipline that demanded everything she had, because raising a child while trying to rebuild a future from almost nothing meant there was no room for hesitation, no space for self-pity, only movement. Forward and constant, and each morning before the sun fully rose she was already awake, preparing lessons for the private school where she taught, her mind shifting between algebra equations and economic theories while one ear remained tuned to the soft breathing of Tiwa sleeping beside her, and though the classroom was small and often too warm, filled with students who did not always understand the value of what they were being given, Amara stood before them with a quiet authority that came not from position but from purpose, because teaching was no longer just a job, it was a stepping stone, a necessary phase in a much larger plan she was constructing piece by piece, and every naira she earned was carefully divided, some for the household, some for her daughter's needs, and a small portion set aside with almost stubborn discipline, because she knew that opportunity, when it finally came, would require readiness, and readiness required sacrifice, and so her nights became an extension of her days, long hours spent researching scholarships, refining applications, rewriting personal statements over and over again until each sentence carried the weight of her reality without sounding like a plea, because she refused to beg for a chance, she intended to earn it. And rejection became a familiar presence in her life, emails that began politely and ended definitively, letters that thanked her for her interest but informed her that other candidates had been selected, and each one landed with a quiet sting that she allowed herself to feel for only a moment before moving on, because stopping was not an option, not when a small child depended entirely on her ability to keep going, and Tiwa, growing quickly in both body and spirit, became both her greatest responsibility and her greatest source of strength, the child's laughter filling the spaces where doubt might have settled, her curiosity a constant reminder of why Amara refused to give up, and there were nights when exhaustion pressed down so heavily that even lifting her pen felt like a task too large to complete, nights when the future she was working toward seemed too distant to reach, but then she would look at her daughter sleeping peacefully, unaware of the battles being fought on her behalf, and something inside Amara would steady itself again. A quiet voice reminding her that this struggle was temporary, that hardship, no matter how persistent, could not outlast determination rooted in purpose, and so she continued, applying. Again and again, learning from each rejection, sharpening her approach, until finally, after what felt like an endless cycle of effort and disappointment, something shifted, an email arrived that did not follow the familiar pattern, one that did not begin with regret but with opportunity, inviting her to interview for a position in a prestigious development program, and for a moment she simply stared at the screen, reading the words over and over as if they might disappear if she blinked too quickly, because this was it. The opening she had been working toward through sleepless nights and disciplined sacrifice, and yet even in that moment of possibility, doubt tried to whisper its way back into her mind, questioning whether she was truly ready, whether she could stand among candidates who had likely come from more stable paths. But Amara had learned something crucial during those difficult years, that confidence is not the absence of doubt but the decision to move forward despite it, and so she prepared with the same intensity she had applied to everything else, practicing her responses, researching the organization, refining her thoughts until they were clear and precise, and when the day of the interview arrived, she stepped into it not as the woman who had been abandoned years ago, but as the woman who had endured, adapted, and rebuilt herself through sheer will, carrying with her not just knowledge but experience, not just ambition but resilience, and as she sat before the panel answering their questions with calm clarity, she realized something powerful, that every struggle she had faced, every rejection she had overcome, had not been obstacles designed to stop her but tools that had shaped her into exactly the person she needed to become to stand in that moment. And when she walked out of that room, she did not know what the result would be, but for the first time in a long while, she felt something she had almost forgotten existed, not relief, not certainty, but hope, strong and steady, like a quiet promise that the life she had been building with such determination was finally beginning to take form in ways she could see. And as she returned home to Tiwa that evening, her daughter running to meet her with open arms and a bright smile, Amara held her tightly and allowed herself, just for a moment, to believe that everything she had endured was leading her exactly where she was meant to go. The call came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind of afternoon that had repeated itself so many times in Amara Bello's life that it had almost lost all distinction, the classroom warm with the slow hum of restless students, chalk dust faintly suspended in the air as she turned from the board to explain a concept she had explained 100 times before, but this time her phone, tucked quietly in her bag, vibrated with an insistence that felt different, and something in her paused, just for a fraction of a second, as if her instincts recognized what her mind had not yet processed, and when she finally stepped out during a short break and answered the call, the voice on the other end was calm, professional, and carrying words that would redraw the trajectory of her entire life, informing her that she had been selected for the program, that after months of waiting, years of effort, and countless moments of quiet perseverance, she had been chosen, and for a brief moment the world seemed to still around her, the noise of the school fading into the background as her reality shifted into something new, something she had fought for so long that it almost felt unreal to finally hold it in her hands. And when she hung up, she did not scream or cry immediately, she simply stood there, breathing slowly, letting the weight of what had just happened settle into her bones, because this was not just an opportunity, it was a door, and she had earned the right to walk through it. Telling her parents that evening was different from the day she had first returned home, because this time the silence that followed her words was filled not with concern but with pride, her father nodding slowly as though confirming something he had always believed about her, her mother smiling in that quiet, knowing way that carried years of faith finally realized. And when Amara looked at Tiwa, who did not yet fully understand the magnitude of what was happening but sensed its importance, she felt a deep, steady certainty settle within her that everything was about to change, and that she was ready for it, even if readiness did not mean the absence of fear. And so preparations began quickly, arrangements made with careful precision, documents gathered, bags packed not just with clothes but with the weight of expectations and the quiet hope of a better life. And when the day came for her to leave Nigeria for the first time, stepping into the airport with her daughter by her side, she carried herself with a composure that hid the storm of emotions beneath, because leaving home, even for growth, is never simple. It requires a kind of courage that is not loud or visible but deeply internal, the courage to trust that what lies ahead is worth what you are leaving behind. Arriving in Abidjan was like stepping into a different rhythm of life, the air thick with unfamiliar sounds and languages, the city alive in a way that felt both exciting and overwhelming, and for the first time in years, Amara found herself in rooms filled with people who thought like her, who analyzed, questioned, and built ideas with the same intensity she had once reserved only for her notebooks, and though the environment was competitive, she did not shrink, because she had spent too long fighting for her place to doubt that she belonged there, and slowly, steadily, she began to find her footing, learning not just the technical demands of her role but the unspoken rules of navigating professional spaces where confidence and competence had to exist side by side, and there were moments, of course, when the pressure felt overwhelming, when the expectations seemed too high and the fear of failure whispered persistently in her ear, but each time she felt that doubt rising, she grounded herself in the truth of her journey, reminding herself that she had not arrived there by accident, that every sleepless night, every rejection, every sacrifice had prepared her for exactly this level of challenge. From Abidjan, her path extended further, opportunities opening in ways she could not have predicted, taking her to Nairobi where the pace of her life accelerated even more, her responsibilities growing, her confidence deepening, her identity shifting from someone who was trying to survive to someone who was actively shaping her future, and through it all, she remained intentional, building connections with care, observing more than she spoke, understanding that success was not just about individual effort but about positioning, about learning how to exist within systems without losing yourself to them, and as the years passed, the version of Amara who had once sat on that cold floor in Ibadan began to feel like a distant memory, not because she had forgotten her, but because she had evolved beyond her, carrying the lessons but leaving behind the limitations, and yet through all of it, through every achievement and every new milestone, one thing remained constant, her role as a mother, the anchor that kept her grounded no matter how far she traveled or how high she rose, because every decision she made, every opportunity she pursued, was still rooted in the promise she had made years ago, that she and her child would be enough. And so when she stood one evening on the balcony of her apartment in Nairobi, looking out over a city that once felt impossibly far from the life she had known, watching Tiwa beside her as the child stared at the skyline with wide, curious eyes and declared that the sky there felt bigger somehow, Amara smiled, not just at the innocence of the statement but at the quiet truth within it, because their world had indeed expanded, beyond fear, beyond limitation, into something vast and full of possibility, and as she wrapped her arm gently around her daughter, she realized that this chapter of her life was not just about success, it was about transformation, about becoming someone who could stand in any room, in any city, and know without question that she belonged there, not because someone had given her permission, but because she had built herself into that reality, step by step, choice by choice, until the life she once imagined was no longer a distant dream but the ground she now stood on. By the time Amara Bello returned to Lagos, she was no longer the woman who had once left with uncertainty packed tightly between her belongings, she was a woman who had learned how to stand firmly in her own name, who had traveled across cities and systems that once felt unreachable, who had sharpened her mind against real challenges and emerged not just capable but formidable, and Lagos, with its restless energy and unfiltered ambition, did not intimidate her the way it might have years ago. Instead it felt like a place that finally matched the rhythm she had grown into, fast, demanding, alive with opportunity, and as her car moved through the familiar yet ever-changing streets, she watched the city with a quiet sense of ownership, not because she possessed it, but because she understood it, and understanding is its own kind of power. Her new apartment in Ikoyi stood as a quiet testament to everything she had worked for, not extravagant in a way that demanded attention, but refined, intentional, every piece of furniture chosen with care, every space arranged to reflect a life that was no longer chaotic but deliberately structured, and on her first night there, after ensuring Tiwa was settled into her room, excited and already adapting to yet another new environment with the resilience children often carry without effort, Amara sat alone in the living room with a glass of chilled zobo, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond her window, and she allowed herself a moment she had postponed for years, a moment to truly acknowledge how far she had come, and from her bag she pulled out the old notebook, the one that had survived every transition, every move, every phase of her life, and she opened it slowly, flipping to the pages filled with the careful handwriting of her younger self, the plans she had once written with hope but without certainty, and one by one she read them, her expression calm but her thoughts layered with memory, and then, with a steady hand, she began to mark them, small, quiet ticks beside each goal she had achieved, and as she moved down the list, she realized something remarkable. She had not only met her expectations, she had surpassed them in ways her younger self could never have imagined, and when she finally closed the notebook, she did so not with pride alone but with a deep, grounded satisfaction, the kind that comes not from recognition or applause, but from knowing you have honored your own potential fully. Her days quickly filled with responsibility, her new role demanding precision, leadership, and an ability to navigate complex financial landscapes with confidence, and she delivered, consistently, because she had spent years preparing for exactly this level of expectation. And in professional spaces she carried herself with a composure that made it clear she was not trying to prove herself anymore, she was simply doing what she was capable of doing, and that distinction mattered, because it shifted how others perceived her, not as someone striving for validation, but as someone who already possessed it internally, and yet despite the demands of her career, she remained present in the parts of her life that mattered most, especially with Tiwa, who was growing into a sharp, observant child with a mind that reflected both curiosity and quiet confidence, and their evenings together, whether spent reviewing schoolwork, sharing stories, or simply existing in comfortable silence, became the anchor that balanced the intensity of her professional world. There were moments, of course, when the past brushed lightly against her thoughts, not as pain anymore, but as memory, distant and softened by time, and Tund Savage existed within that memory like a chapter that had been fully read and carefully closed, no longer holding emotional weight, no longer shaping her present, just a part of the story that had led her to where she was, and that, perhaps, was the most powerful transformation of all, not success, not independence, but detachment, the ability to look at what once defined you and recognize that it no longer has any authority over your life. And then came the invitation. It arrived as a simple message, professional, unremarkable on the surface, an invitation to a high-level business networking dinner at a well-known venue in Lagos, the kind of event she had attended many times before, the kind that often blended into routine. And for a moment she considered declining, her schedule already demanding, her time carefully allocated, but something in her paused, a subtle instinct that she had learned not to ignore, and so she accepted, not knowing that this decision, small as it seemed, would bring her face to face with a past she had long moved beyond. The evening of the event arrived with the polished elegance typical of Lagos's elite gatherings, the venue alive with conversation, ambition, and the quiet negotiations that shaped industries behind closed doors. And Amara entered the room with the same calm confidence she carried into every professional space, her presence composed, her focus clear, and as she moved through the crowd, exchanging greetings, engaging in conversations that mattered, she felt entirely in control of her environment. Until, in a moment that seemed almost suspended in time, her eyes landed on a familiar figure across the room. Tund Savage. He stood among a group of men, dressed sharply, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested a life that had continued without visible disruption, and for a brief second, the past and present collided, not violently, but with a quiet intensity that demanded acknowledgement, and she observed him the way she might observe any other detail in the room, calmly, analytically, noting the changes, the similarities, the passage of time written subtly across his face, and then, just as quickly, she shifted her focus, because the most important thing about that moment was not that she had seen him, but that seeing him did not change her, and with that realization settling firmly within her, she straightened slightly, reached for a glass from a passing tray, and continued walking forward, not away from him, but through the room, because she had business to attend to, and her life, the one she had built with deliberate care, did not pause for ghosts from the past. And somewhere behind her, at that exact moment, he turned and saw her. When Tund Savage saw Amara bellow across the room, the world around him did not stop in the dramatic way people often imagine, the music did not fade, the conversations did not pause, the glasses did not freeze midair, everything continued exactly as it had been. And yet something inside him shifted so abruptly it felt as though the ground beneath his certainty had quietly given way, because the woman he was looking at was not the one he had left behind 9 years ago. She carried herself with a stillness that was not passive but controlled, a presence that did not demand attention yet commanded it effortlessly, and for a few seconds he simply watched her, as if trying to reconcile the image before him with the memory he had preserved for years, but memory, he would soon realize, is a poor substitute for reality, especially when reality has grown beyond what you allowed it to become in your absence. Amara, on the other hand, had already processed the moment, already filed it away in the part of her mind that handled unexpected variables, and by the time he began moving toward her, she had returned fully to the conversation she was engaged in, her attention precise, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, because she understood something he was only just beginning to confront, that this meeting, no matter how significant it felt to him, did not hold the same weight for her, and when he finally reached her side and said her name, just her name, Amara, there was a slight pause, not of hesitation, but of acknowledgement, before she turned to look at him, her face calm, polite, and entirely unreadable. Tund, she replied, her tone even, giving nothing away, not warmth, not hostility, just recognition, and for a moment he struggled, not with what to say, but with how to say it, because everything he had imagined over the years about this encounter felt suddenly inadequate in the presence of who she had become, and after a brief exchange of formalities that felt more like a negotiation of boundaries than a conversation, he asked if they could speak privately, and she, after a quick glance at the room and a mental calculation that seemed almost instinctive, agreed, but with a condition. You have 8 minutes, she said, her voice steady, controlled, and in that moment he understood that whatever this conversation was going to be, it would happen on her terms. They moved to a quieter corner near the tall windows where the lights of Legos reflected softly against the dark water outside, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled not with awkwardness but with history, dense and layered, and when Tund finally began, he did not waste time with pleasantries, perhaps sensing that anything less than honesty would be dismissed immediately. I made a mistake, he said, the words simple but carrying years of unspoken weight. I've known it for a long time, and as he spoke, explaining, not defensively but with a clarity that suggested he had replayed this truth in his mind countless times, Amara listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, because she had already lived through the consequences of his realization. And when he finished, there was a brief pause before she responded. Is that an apology? She asked, not sharply, but directly, and when he nodded, she simply said, accepted, not as a gesture of reconciliation, but as a statement of closure, because forgiveness, she had learned, was not something you gave to release the other person, it was something you gave to free yourself. But Tund was not finished, and the question that followed was the one that shifted the conversation from the past into something far more complicated. Is there a child? He asked, his voice no longer steady, and for the first time, something deeper moved beneath the surface of the moment, not visible, but present, and Amara met his gaze without hesitation. Yes, she said, her name is Tiwa. She's 8 years old. She's healthy, she's brilliant, and she's the best person I know, and the impact of those words settled heavily between them, because they were not just information, they were a reality he had not been part of, a life that had continued fully without him. I want to meet her, he said, the urgency in his voice breaking through the composure he had tried to maintain. I want to make things right. And before he could continue, Amara responded with a single word, calm, firm, and absolute, no, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any long explanation could have, because it was not emotional, it was not reactive, it was a decision made long ago and held with clarity, and when he tried to argue, to speak of rights and responsibility, she did not raise her voice, did not match his urgency, she simply stated the truth as she saw it. You have legal rights if you choose to pursue them, she said, and I will not obstruct that. But what I will not do is open a door simply because you have decided you would like to walk through it now. And her words were precise, measured, leaving no room for misinterpretation. She is not a door, she is not a wound, and she is not something you can return to when it is convenient. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, because this was no longer about apology, it was about consequence, and Tund, for perhaps the first time, was facing the full reality of what his absence had created, not just in loss, but in independence, in a life that no longer required him to complete it. And Amara, sensing that their time was nearly over, added one final truth, not unkind, but unwavering. I am not angry with you, she said, her voice softer now but no less firm, but I am not available to you either, and those are two very different things. And with that, she stepped away, returning to the table, to her conversation, to her life, leaving him standing there with the realization that the chapter he thought he could reopen had already been closed. Not abruptly, not bitterly, but completely. And as he stood there, watching her rejoin the world he was no longer part of, Tund understood something that no amount of time or regret could undo, that some decisions do not just change your path, they remove you entirely from someone else's story, and no matter how much you wish to return, you cannot step back into a place that has already learned to exist without you. Tund Savage sat in his car long after the lights of the Lagos night had begun to thin into a quieter rhythm, his hands resting loosely on the steering wheel, his mind replaying the conversation he had just left behind, not in fragments but in full. Each word Amara had spoken landing with a clarity that left no space for denial, because what unsettled him most was not her refusal, not even the distance she had placed between them, it was the calm certainty with which she had done it, the absence of anger where he had expected at least a trace of it, because anger, he realized, would have meant there was still something connecting them, some unresolved thread tying his past actions to her present emotions, but what he had encountered instead was something far more final. A woman who had moved beyond the need to feel anything about him at all, and that understanding settled heavily within him, not as punishment, but as consequence, the kind that arrives quietly and stays. In the weeks that followed, he did what he should have done years ago, not out of impulse or guilt, but through structure, through responsibility, reaching out through legal channels, initiating the process properly, because if there was anything left for him to do, it would not be done through sudden appearances or emotional appeals, it would be done with patience, with respect for boundaries he had once ignored, and when the letter arrived at Amara's office, formal and precise, expressing his intention to establish a relationship with his daughter, she read it without surprise, because she had anticipated this possibility long before it became reality, and after a moment of quiet reflection, she placed the paper down and made a call of her own, not out of resistance, but out of intention, because if this process was going to unfold, it would unfold carefully, with every step measured against one standard alone, what was best for Tiwa. That evening, as she drove through the familiar flow of Lagos traffic to pick her daughter up from school, the city alive with its usual chaos and energy, her thoughts were not tangled or uncertain, they were clear, grounded in the understanding that life does not always present situations in clean resolutions, sometimes it offers you complexities that require patience rather than reaction, and when Tiwa entered the car, her presence immediately filling the space with bright, unfiltered energy. Talking rapidly about her day, a debate she had won, a mistake someone else had made, Amara listened fully, responding with the same attention she always gave, because in that moment, this, not the past, not the legal process beginning to unfold, was what mattered most. There would come a time, she knew, when questions would grow deeper, when Tiwa would be old enough to understand not just the outline of her story but the full weight of it, and when that time came, Amara had already decided how she would tell it, not as a story of abandonment, not as a narrative shaped by pain, but as a truth presented with clarity, one that acknowledged what had happened without allowing it to define what followed, because she believed that her daughter deserved honesty, not protection built on half-truths, and more importantly, she deserved the freedom to form her own understanding, her own choices, when she was ready. And in the quiet moments later that night, after dinner had been shared and laughter had settled into stillness, Amara stood by the window of her home, looking out at the city she had once dreamed of conquering and had instead learned to belong to, and she reflected not on what had been lost, but on what had been built, the years of effort, the resilience shaped through challenge, the life she now lived not as an escape from her past but as a continuation of everything she had chosen to become. And there was a sense of completeness in that realization, not perfection, not finality, but wholeness, the understanding that a life does not need to be untouched by hardship to be meaningful, it needs only to be owned fully. Because in the end, this was never just a story about a man who left and returned, it was a story about a woman who stayed, who endured, who rebuilt herself so completely that when the past came knocking, it found not a broken version of who she once was, but someone entirely transformed. Someone who no longer needed validation, closure, or even recognition from the source of her greatest trial, and that transformation, quiet and steady, was the true resolution of everything that had come before. And as she turned away from the window, moving back into the life she had created with deliberate care, she carried with her a truth that required no announcement, no explanation, a truth that lived simply in the way she existed, that you are not defined by who walks away from you. You are defined by what you choose to build after they do, and sometimes, the most powerful form of justice is not confrontation, not revenge, not even reconciliation, but becoming so complete within yourself that the absence that once threatened to break you no longer has any place to exist.